Thank you, Jeff. Let me ask, can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. 2 weeks ago seems so long ago. Yeah, originally it was supposed to be 1 week after another. And for some reason, 2 weeks seems like such a long time. But you may remember that 2 weeks ago, I talked a little bit about Hieronymus Munzer's itinerary or pilgrimage, where he left the town of Nuremberg and went wandering through France and Spain and talking about all the extraordinary things that he saw in different places. And you may be wondering, what about the other way around? Are there, from the period we're dealing with, the High and Late Middle Ages, the time when towns were resurgent, are there accounts of local circumstances written by people from within? And the answer to that question is, there are dozens. There are so many that there is even a Wikipedia article on them. Now, I don't expect you to read the fine print here, but if you want, you can look up the Wikipedia article. This list of descriptions of cities is long, but it's not complete. There are more even that are listed here. The earliest of them are from the 8th century. For the first few centuries, they are largely from Italy, but then other countries get in on the act. The accounts from the 12th and 13th centuries tend to manifest a growing kind of civic consciousness, a pride of the citizens in their resurgent cities. When you get to later centuries, the accounts tend to get very particular, very detailed, often statistical. There's one description of Paris from 1434 that tells us that every week, on average, there were 3,000 sheep eaten in Paris, 200 salted pigs and 300 unsalted pigs. And every day, 700 barrels of wine were sold in Paris, not counting what was sold to the students. This same account tells us that there was one bridge that was so heavily trafficked in the year 1400 that one always, on crossing this bridge, encountered either a white monk or a white horse. I'm not sure why it tells us that, but it does. The author of this account tells us about particular individuals he knows around Paris. Willem, the goldsmith, Clignamedi, the bagpiper. But then he goes on to talk about women, no names. The beautiful herb seller, the beautiful sausage maker. I think he was too bashful to ask for their names. But on the whole, he's very detailed and often statistical. You get that kind of account. There are 3 of these descriptions that are particularly famous. This one above all, Master Benedict's Wonders of the City of Rome from the mid-12th century. On the left-hand side, we see the earliest manuscript of this treatise from the late 12th century, and then a 15th century woodcut from an early printed edition of it. This was hugely, hugely popular among visitors to Rome, and especially among pilgrims to Rome. And what it gives is this hodgepodge of undigested material, much of it wildly erroneous, but still it shows a genuine enthusiasm for everything you can see when you come as a visitor or a pilgrim to Rome, all of the sacred sites, but most especially the sites of pagan antiquity, the temples, the imperial palaces, and so forth. We'll talk about that in a little while. It's full of legends. There is, for example, the legend that in the days of the Roman Empire, in the capital, there were statues representing the various provinces of the Roman Empire. And each statue carried a bell. And if one of the bells rang, that meant that there was a rebellion fermenting in that province. So the emperor would immediately send troops to that province to quell the rebellion. That's a legend that goes back to the 8th century. This guidebook to Rome, this famous guidebook to Rome, tells us how Rome got founded. Noah and his sons founded a little settlement on the Tiber, and so did Saturn, the god Saturn, and Janus, and Hercules and Evander, and Roma, the daughter of Aeneas, along with a bunch of Trojans. And then along came Romulus, and he built walls around all of these settlements, enclosing them in a city which he named Rome for himself. Show of hands. How many of you want to take this as a reliable guide to the history of Rome? Good, good. I see we have an appropriately critical audience here. As I say, this book was hugely popular, especially among the floods of pilgrims who came to Rome. For Paris, we have John of Gendon, his treatise on the praises of Paris. He had gotten himself into a little bit of trouble because he had mentioned that he actually prefers the town, smaller town up to the north of Paris, Senlis. And someone took him to task for that, saying, what do you mean you like Senlis? Just look at Paris, look how wonderful Paris is. So he wrote this long treatise saying, okay, fine, you like Paris. There are wonderful things in Paris, where there are these marvelous churches, palaces, all sorts of, he describes the market in some detail. And then he goes on to say, but I still prefer Senlis. He talks about the characteristics of the citizens of Paris. He's a philosopher at the university. And as a philosopher, he knows as Aristotle. And he knows for Aristotle, you're supposed to stick to the mean between extremes. So what are the characteristics of people in Paris? On the whole, they adhere to the mean between wrathfulness and indolence. If they deviate from the mean, it's toward a certain irascibility, but they don't deviate very far. They tend to the mean between gigantic height and dwarvish smallness. And again, if they deviate from the mean, it's just slightly in one direction or the other. There's a lot of that stuff. From England, from London, we have a treatise on the city of London, which is actually the preface to a saint's life. This is kind of unexpected, but it is the preface to the life of St. Thomas, Archbishop and Martyr. And it begins by saying that St. Thomas adorned two cities. He's famously connected with Canterbury, where his shrine is, but he came from London. So he adorned London by his rising and Canterbury by his setting. And he goes on to say, William Fitzstephen goes on to say, I do not think there's any city deserving of greater approval for its customs in respect of church going, honor paid to the ordinance of God, keeping of feast days, giving of alms, etc., etc., etc. But then he says, he kind of sits back and relaxes and says, well, okay, furthermore, we should consider the sports of the city, because it is not appropriate that a city should be useful and sober and pious and devout unless it is also pleasant and merry. So he talks about the theaters, the carnival, the cockfights, the ball games, the tournaments, the naval tourneys, the bullfights, the dog fights, the bears that have dogs sticked on them, the way the bears fight against the hounds. And he says, when the marsh to the north of the city of London is frozen over, if it gets cold enough, dense throngs of young people go forth to disport themselves on the ice. And they go running across the ice and skidding on the ice, and they fall flat on their faces, almost all of them. And fairly frequently they crash into each other, but they have great fun in the process. Okay, so yes, the answer to the question is yes, there are lots of these city descriptions, and these are three of them. We'll be coming back to them as we proceed. I want to make an argument. I mean, not a contentious argument, but I want to outline a thesis for you. That in each of these cases that we've glanced at, Rome, Paris, and London, what we find is not a single sacred past that people hold up for inspection, but a layering of one sacred past over another. In the case of Rome, we start out with the Rome of pagan antiquity, which people are often absolutely fascinated by, and layered on top of that is the Rome of early Christianity. In the case of Paris, we have the Paris of late antiquity, the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th centuries. And then layered on top of that is the Paris of the Capetian monarchy, King Louis IX, Saint Louis, and his dynasty in and around the 13th century. In the case of London, the obvious breaking point is 1066, the Norman conquest. And what we want to look at is the way pre-conquest, let's say Anglo-Saxon England, Anglo-Saxon London, relates to post-conquest London. But it gets more complicated than that. In the case of Rome, the relationship between pagan antiquity and early Christian Rome tends to be vexed and complicated and ambivalent. And we'll see how that relationship, that layering, is more complicated than the others. When we talk about Paris, what I'm going to argue is that the connection between early Paris and the Paris of the Capetians is the most fully integrated of these connections. In the case of London, the relationship between pre-conquest and post-conquest London is the thinnest of the connections. There is less tie between the early and the later stage than we have in the other cases. So this slide gives you my lecture in a nutshell. Okay? Rome. I could ask for a show of hands how many of you have been in Rome, but we'll skip that. Why did Rome have the allure that it did? Why did it have the authority that it did? We've got to start with the official answer to that question. The official answer from the church's perspective is this passage from the Gospel of Matthew, in which Christ turns to St. Peter and hands him the keys to the kingdom of heaven and says to St. Peter, "You are Peter." The name Peter means rock. "Upon this rock I will build my church. The gates of hell will not prevail against it. To you, Peter in particular, I will give the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." That passage from Matthew's gospel is humongously important for articulating the whole conception of how the Roman Catholic Church conceives itself and how the church conceives Rome, the place where Peter served as bishop and was martyred and was buried, explains why Rome has the significance that it does. Peter was the prince of the apostles, the one who held the keys to the kingdom of heaven. He then moved to Rome, died and was martyred in Rome as the bishop of Rome, and bishop of Rome equals pope. So Peter was the first pope. And all the succeeding popes, as successors to Peter, inherited his primacy. So all succeeding popes have the keys to the kingdom of heaven in their hands. Okay, now we could argue about any of these principles, but this is kind of the foundation charter for the Roman Catholic Church and for Rome as the capital of that church. I think to get a little bit more nuanced, we have to recognize that as people looked back on the early centuries of Christian Rome, when it was at odds with pagan Rome, they saw themselves in a kind of complex, ambiguous relationship. Christian Rome was heir to pagan Rome because medieval Christians loved their Virgil. They loved their Cicero. They recognized the importance of Ovid and other writers of pagan antiquity. But they also saw themselves not just heirs to pagan Rome, but victims of pagan Rome. Yeah, they had an abiding fascination with the early martyrs, real and fictional. So they were victims as well as heirs. Let's look more closely at what it means to speak of Christian Rome as heir to pagan Rome. The Roman Empire was divided into provinces, and the early Christian church was divided into provinces. Provinces were divided into dioceses. The early Christian church Still to this day, provinces are divided into dioceses. But that's just the superficial level. The Bishop of Rome, as the bishop of the traditional capital of the Roman Empire, the capital did kind of move elsewhere, but the traditional capital was Rome, and the Bishop of Rome exercised authority by virtue of his being in this capital city. If people had quarrels out there in the provinces, they could appeal their quarrels to Rome. They wanted someone who could resolve conflict for them. So he gained the right of jurisdictional appeal. When the Roman Empire, or at least the Western Roman Empire, dissolved, you needed somebody to rebuild the walls, to protect the city from the barbarians, or at least to try to do that. And the Bishop of Rome stepped into a role corresponding to that of the emperor. He exercised civil as well as ecclesiastical authority. So in those ways, Christian Rome became the heir to the old pagan Roman imperial authority. This is kind of stunning. The term Pontifex Maximus, high priest, is a title which the Roman emperors had taken for themselves. And starting in the mid-5th century, Pope Leo I began to use the title Pontifex Maximus for himself, so that the Pope takes over from the Roman emperors the title of high priest. And you say to yourself, well, that probably lasted a few generations, maybe through the Middle Ages? No. We have here Caesar on a coin with the inscription, the title Pontifex Maximus, and then Pope Leo XIII, and even Pope Pius XII is still issuing coins with his portrait, and he's still identifying himself as the heir to the old Roman high priest, a title that was used by Roman emperors. Pius XII. I don't think Francis still uses that title. I could be corrected on that. There's a famous forgery called the Donation of Constantine, done in the 8th century, claimed to be from back in the time of the Emperor Constantine. And the claim is that Constantine gifted the whole western part of the empire to the Pope and to the popes in perpetuity. It's very complicated, but the basic idea is, sure, there may be secular rulers of Italy and Gaul and England and Germany and all that, but they rule under the authority of the Pope because, the Emperor Constantine, the first Christian emperor, gave the western half of the empire to the Pope. That's the claim. As I say, it's a forgery. As we proceed through the early Middle Ages, 6th through 10th century, what we find is the old Mediterranean empire is dissolving. The Muslims have conquered North Africa. Ties between East and West have been attenuated at best. So the old Mediterranean Roman Empire has basically fallen to ruin. And a new political order emerges, which is more European. It includes the northern part of Europe and the British Isles and so forth. So the Mediterranean Roman Empire is superseded by what we now call Europe. And Western Europe became Western Europe largely because there were missionaries who went to England, to Germany, to other places, incorporating them within a new cultural and political community. And we see here in this picture, Pope Gregory the Great sending Augustine of Canterbury off to England to serve as missionary. So the missionary work was at least part of what achieved the formation of a new political and cultural entity, Europe, to displace the old Roman Empire. When the missionaries went about to England and Germany and so forth, they recognized an allegiance with Rome, which is solidified in the form of an intense devotion to St. Peter, recognized as the Bishop of Rome, the first Pope. So when Gregory the Great sends missionaries to England, he is acting as a successor to Peter, and those missionaries take with them this intense devotion to the first Pope. St. Peter is shown here wearing the triple tiara of a Pope. It's a little bit, it's more than a little bit anachronistic, but the idea is clear. If you're part of this newly forming Europe, you were devoted to Peter, the first pope. We've already seen that the popes saw themselves as having been given political authority by Constantine. How did they exercise it? When Charlemagne was crowned as the Holy Roman Emperor, he was crowned by the Pope. It was the Pope who decided to crown him. The Pope felt entitled to bestow that title. And in the early 13th, no, the late 12th century, at his coronation as Pope, Pope Innocent III declares himself to be placed between God and man, the judge of all, but he can be judged by none. And indeed, he exercised incredible authority over kingdoms. The Kingdom of England and other kingdoms were technically under the subjection to the papacy. So that's one side. Christian Rome kind of absorbs the culture of pagan Roman antiquity. It's Virgil, it's Cicero, and so forth, absorbs its political and cultural authority. But on the other hand, Christian Rome always sees itself as victimized, as the victim of pagan Rome. As I've said, there is an enduring fascination with martyrs, of the martyrs of the old Roman Empire, real martyrs and invented fictional martyrs. Martyrs like Christopher and George, and that can go on. And where in the western part of the Mediterranean world do you find the densest concentration of those martyrs? In the city of Rome, which means, of course, that they have more relics, more shrines of the early martyrs for people to visit as pilgrims. Already in the age of Constantine, just after the age of martyrdom has ended, early 4th century, you have the first Christian emperor, and under him and his successors, you have massive basilicas being constructed over cemeteries, over places where the martyrs have been buried. Multiple examples of this, but by far the most famous of them is St. Peter's. Now you may say to yourselves, wait a minute, I've been to Rome. St. Peter's doesn't look anything like that. Well, it doesn't now, but when St. Peter's Basilica was first built under the Emperor Constantine, this is what it looked like. Does this look like anything in particular to you? You go through the main entrance into a courtyard with a fountain in it. Where would you find that? Yeah, you'd also find it in a mosque. But anyway, this is St. Peter's as it was first built, a major basilica. In the late 6th century, Pope Gregory the Great, Gregory the First, redesigned the end of this basilica where St. Peter was supposed to have been buried to facilitate the visits of pilgrims. The idea was you wanted the altar, which is encircled in yellow, to be directly over the shrine of the saint, the martyred Saint Peter, which is encircled in red. But you also want pilgrims to have easy access to that shrine. So he builds this crypt in the form of a semicircle. You can come in at one side of the semicircle, make your way along the corridor, duck into the shrine itself to venerate the saint, and then come back on the other side. And this design for a shrine for a martyr becomes very popular, but Gregory the Great is the one who designed this. The whole idea is you're going to have masses of pilgrims. Do you have masses of pilgrims? Well, indeed you do, because Rome caught on very quickly as the major center for pilgrimage in Europe. As early as the late 4th century, we have comment on how emperors, consuls, leaders of armies are gathering at the tombs of humble fishermen and a tent maker in Rome, St. Peter, St. Paul, the other saints. Dignitaries are going on pilgrimage to the shrines of Rome. By the mid-8th century, St. Boniface is calling for someone to issue some kind of guidelines, some kind of restrictions, because he's claiming that if you go anywhere in France, in the Rhineland and Lombardy, you will find poor women who have been led astray. They have started out as pilgrims to Rome, and for one reason or other, they have ended up as prostitutes along the pilgrimage route. We go to Rome and we find the tombs of kings from early medieval England who have gone to Rome in their later days, either abdicating their kingdom or in some cases, they went there as pilgrims and died in Rome. In any event, there are several English kings who are buried in Rome. In the mid-9th century, there was a pope who boasted that every day, thousands of pilgrims came to Rome. There was a route that became established leading from Canterbury down through Gaul, or what we would now call France, through Western Switzerland down to Italy. It was primarily a route for pilgrims, sort of like the Camino now across northern Spain, the Via Francigena, the way of pilgrims. And in Rome, in the 8th century, there was a king of Wessex in England who established a kind of hospice for the English pilgrims in Rome. There were enough pilgrims going there that it was important to have a place for them to stay. And the king of England, established this hospice. When people went to the catacombs, by no means the only place they went, but they did go to the catacombs, and they would often leave graffiti. We have dozens of these graffiti that have been studied. This one from, I think, sometime around the 6th or 7th century gives a couple of people's names. It's kind of garbled, but it gives a couple of names, and then it ends, "In God always." These graffiti are often in Latin, a late Latin, and if you studied classical Latin, it may seem garbled. Many of the inscriptions are in Greek, and on the right here we have inscriptions in runes, because there are people from England and Scandinavia who would have written their graffiti in runes. Many of these inscriptions, these graffiti in the catacombs, indicate that there are pilgrims who went to Rome because they saw themselves as sinners who were going to Rome to get absolved of their sin. So the word peccator shows up a lot in these graffiti. Tannhäuser was not the only one who went to Rome to get rid of his sins. This is a relatively late graffito in one of the catacombs. This is maybe 9th century, and it's in a form of Latin that's kind of halfway toward the vernacular. It says, "Do not speak the secrets out loud," or that's what it seems to say. Now, what exactly does that mean? Who knows? But there it is. The pilgrim left this in the catacombs. What did they see when they got to Rome? We've already gotten some premonition of that from the wonders of the city of Rome. Here's a map that shows us the city of Rome. You can see the outline of the walls around the city. Forget the walls. Yeah, most of that is vacant land. It's used for livestock mostly, because the population of Rome has dwindled terribly. That triangle in what we call rose color is where the population was chiefly centered. So it's a fairly small part of what we think of as Rome that is really, really significantly populated. Off to the right, we have Santa Maria Maggiore and the Lateran Church, St. John Lateran. There are little clusters, little villages gathered around those basilicas. And then, of course, there's St. Peter's off to the left, to the west. That's where the Bishop of Rome is? No, that's not his seat. Yeah, he's at the Church of St. John Lateran. But still, the Basilica of St. Peter, and the Pope resided, still to this day, the Pope's cathedral is St. John Lateran, not St. Peter's. But St. Peter's is still important, primarily important because of St. Peter being buried there, so it's a center of pilgrimage. There were sacred sites all over the place, but there were also remnants of pagan temples and imperial palaces, all sorts of stuff from pagan antiquity, which, as we know from that guidebook, people delighted to go and investigate. Whether they understood what they were seeing or not, they delighted in that contact with both Christian and pagan antiquity. In the 12th century, there were poets who wrote about Rome, and they showed a real kind of complex ambivalence toward Rome. One theme that we find all over the place is the city of Rome has fallen into ruin. Well, indeed it had. Rome of old stands but a name, says Bernard of Cluny. Rome, you have perished. And like Hildebert of Lavardin, who says you go to Rome and you'll find it in fragments, just broken. But from those fragments, you can extrapolate and get a sense of, oh my God, what it once was. Another theme, though, is that Rome is better off under Christ than under the Caesars. Bernard of Cluny talks about how the crucified king set out to give Rome more than Caesar gave it. Caesar gave these foreign territories, the whole Roman Empire, to Rome. But Christ bestowed a heavenly land upon Rome, the kingdom of heaven. And Hildebert of Lavardin imagines the city of Rome itself speaking, saying, oh, I can scarcely remember myself, can scarcely remember who I once was. But still, I'm aware that even in my present fallen, ragged condition, I'm better off than I was back then. As a pauper, I am greater than a rich man. Laid low, I am greater than standing. And along with those two themes, there is the further theme. You go to the court of the Pope, and you find that everybody you encounter, every doorkeeper, every cardinal, the Pope himself, has his hand out wanting a bribe. We read about this sort of thing in the Chicago Tribune all the time. But it tends not to be about popes. Back to Bernard of Cluny, who talks about how venal, how corrupt the papal court is. And this one line that he has here is wonderful in Latin. It's dense, but it's worth looking at. Roma dat omnibus omnia dantibus omnia Romae. Rome gives anything you want to anybody, as long as the anybody in question gives everything to Rome. So Rome gives all to all who give all to Rome. This wonderfully dense condensation of this theme of Rome, and especially the papal court, as absolutely corrupt. In the late Middle Ages, the theme of papal Rome and Rome as a pilgrimage site is given a new lease on life by the Jubilee. Pope Boniface VIII, in the year 1300, we are told, was visited by a man who came from somewhere north of the Alps, who claimed that he was 107 years old, and his father had told him that back in the year 1200, he had come to Rome and had gotten a special indulgence. And the father had told this 107-year-old man, I want you to do that in the year 1300 if you're still alive and kicking. Should I ask for a show of hands how many people believe that story? I think I'll make some assumptions here. But that is the story that is told. And that story is kind of the foundation legend for the Jubilee. And Pope Boniface VIII says, that's a great idea. Why don't I give to everyone who comes to Rome in the year 1300 a special indulgence, release from all the temporal punishment for all of your sins. Now that's theologically complicated, but it's a big deal. It's a really big deal. And immediately we're told the pilgrims from beyond the Alps came like the march of armies. There's a man from Savoy who's over 100 years old, who's carried to Rome by his son. And the cardinals at the altars of the various churches of Rome rake in infinite money, we are told, day and night. Boniface envisages that there will be a jubilee every 100 years, but later popes decide it's such a good deal, and human life is so short that they tinker with the length of time between indulgences. Notice the last jubilee on the list. You still have your chance. Medieval chroniclers tend to gauge the significance of an event by how many people get trampled to death. And when pilgrims came to Rome for the Jubilee, we are told there are occasions when 6, 8, 12 people will be trampled to death. On one occasion, there was a cardinal who was riding a mule across a bridge. The mule got excited and started kicking and killed lots of people, dozens of people. In fact, 200 people were told, and others were precipitated into the Tiber. Okay, so early Christianity layered on top of pagan antiquity. Is it a relationship of adversity? Not simply because people are fascinated by the old Roman pagan empire and they claim to absorb that, but still they recognize it as the force that victimized them. There's a fascination with the poets, with the rhetors, with the emperors, with the imperial titles, with the pagan ruins. They recognize it is all in ruins, but they're still fascinated by it. It is an extraordinarily complicated relationship. What about Paris? We have Paris of late antiquity. We'll see what that means. We have Paris of the Capetian monarchy, especially King Louis IX. And I want to argue the connection here, it's fully integrated. Begin with Saint Denis. I'm going to use Denis for the person and Denis for the basilica. Saint Denis is supposed to have been the first bishop of Paris back in the 3rd century. We see him here on the left coming into the city of Paris. We see him on the right preaching to the people of Paris and converting them to Christianity. This manuscript is early 14th century. It is a deluxe manuscript produced at the Abbey of Saint-Denis on the north side of Paris. It was produced as a gift for the king and was officially presented to King Philip V. So it is a demonstration of a close connection between the Abbey of Saint-Denis and the French monarchy. But it's also a demonstration of the close connection between Saint-Denis and the monarchy and the city of Paris. Because if we look closely, we find on many of these miniatures, down at the bottom, there is a scene at the river, the Seine, showing ships going up and down the river, and people on the quay, on the banks of the Seine, merchants selling their wares, artisans producing their wares, everything from goldsmiths to rag pickers. And I don't want to dwell in detail, but it's this wonderful representation of fascination with daily life, the ordinary life of Paris, up to and including a dancing bear. So if you want a demonstration of the close connectedness, the interconnectedness of the early Christianity, the very first bishop, Saint Denis, and his foundation, the monastery of Saint-Denis, and the French monarchy, and the citizens of Paris, this manuscript kind of does it. Okay, moving forward. Saint Denis gets taken before a representative of the emperor who realizes that, he's converting lots of people to Christianity. That's a problem. So he gets tried and he gets tortured in various ways. He's thrown into a fiery furnace and put on a gridiron and thrown to the lions, and he's even crucified. None of these torments kills him. But in the end, like so many of the martyrs, he's martyred this way, that way, the other way. In the end, when he finally succumbs to his beheading. Okay, but there's a problem. There's a problem. He is beheaded at Montmartre. It's supposed to be the highest place in Paris. And then he's buried at Saint-Denis. How does he get from Montmartre to Saint-Denis? After he's beheaded, he reaches down and picks his head up. And with the help of 2 angels, he walks from the one place to the other, preaching a sermon the whole way. So we have to imagine he's holding his head in his hands, and the head is kind of preaching the sermon. That's the way he is traditionally depicted in art, holding his head. He is one of a whole bunch of cephalophore saints, head-carrying saints. There are well over 100 of these in France alone, these head-carrying saints. When you're depicting these saints in art, you've got a fundamental decision to make. Where do you put the halo? Sometimes they put the halo where the head would have been. Sometimes they put the halo around the head that's been removed. So you've got to make up your mind. Anyway, there are further complications. The Saint Denis, first bishop of Paris, gets confused, or to be less prejudicial, gets identified with two other characters. The Acts of the Apostles in the New Testament tells us that the Apostle Paul went to Athens and he preached in the Areopagus, and at the end of his sermon, he made two converts to Christianity. One of them is a character named Dionysius from the Areopagus, so Dionysius the Areopagite. Then, around the year 500 or so, there is a Syriac theologian who wrote a series of tremendously important Neoplatonist theological treatises, and he represents himself as this Dionysius the Areopagite. So the character from the Acts of the Apostles and the later theologian get identified with each other, and Dionysius, Dionysius, pretty much the same, right? So Denis, the first bishop of Paris, gets identified with both of these other characters. It's a mélange that people take for granted for centuries. And here, back to our deluxe manuscript, we have Denis, the bishop of Paris, getting identified on the left as Dionysius from the Acts of the Apostles, and on the right, he's identified with the theologian Dionysius. Okay, are we finished with Saint Denis? No, we are not finished with Saint Denis, although you might think we are. Saint Genevieve, but if I'm going to say Denis, should I say Genevieve? I'll say Genevieve. Was a pious young woman who at the age of 15 consecrated herself as a virgin, moved to the city of Paris, and was famous for her extreme fasting and for her visions of saints and angels. There were enemies who tried to kill her, but she came under the protection of some important people. She became very popular in the city of Paris, even in her own day. When Attila the Hun was threatening to attack Paris, we have Genevieve kneeling in prayer, a kind of prayer marathon, which was credited with diverting Attila and the Huns from the city. And that's one of the favors she did for the city of Paris. Okay, this Genevieve is said around the year 475 to have purchased a plot of land at the place where Saint Denis had been buried, and she arranged for a small chapel to be built there. That chapel became a famous pilgrimage site in the 5th and 6th centuries. Later on, it became an abbey, and it had 500 or more monks in this abbey. So Saint Genevieve is the one who gets the ball rolling, putting up a pilgrimage site for people to come and pay their veneration to Saint Denis. And that then leads to the construction of an abbey, which goes through various rebuilding campaigns. The most famous is in the 12th century, when the abbot Suger, yes, Suger, rebuilds the east end and the west end and makes it into the first Gothic church. I mean, we could talk about that, but basically the first Gothic church. And then in the 13th century, the nave in between the east and the west gets rebuilt. Let's not go into a lot of detail on that, although one could teach an entire course on this building. For our purposes, what may be more important is that in the 13th century, along with the rebuilding campaign of the nave, it becomes the necropolis for the French dynasties, for the French monarchs. At the very outset, when this structure, this portion of the basilica had been built, 16 former kings and queens were relocated to this basilica. And after that, virtually every king of France from the 10th century up to the 19th century was buried there. So it is a basilica with intense connection with the French monarchy. Then along comes the French Revolution, never mind that. That establishment of the royal necropolis at Saint-Denis Abbey was done during the minority of King Louis IX, Saint Louis. He surely knew about this and approved of it, gave it his blessing. But while we're talking about Saint Louis, there's something else to be said about him, which is that fairly early in his reign, he gained possession in complicated ways from the Eastern Mediterranean of the crown of thorns. He purchased this indirectly from the emperor of Constantinople. And when it arrived in France, he went and took it, received it, and walked barefoot a couple hundred miles to the city of France, the city of Paris, to be enshrined in the building which he put up for that purpose, called, of course, the Sainte-Chapelle. And there we have the Sainte-Chapelle of Paris, which was constructed specifically to house that crown of thorns and various other relics which Louis had purchased from the emperor of Constantinople. It is a magnificent chapel on two levels. The upper level is where the relics were kept, the crown of thorns and other relics. There's a fragment of the cross of Christ. The lance that Christ was pierced with is added to the collection. All of that is in the upper chapel, and that is where the royal family went for services. The lower level, shown below here, is where courtiers and servants and soldiers would attend services. When this chapel was put up, and the crown of thorns, Christ's own crown of thorns, with which he bore on his head when he was crucified, when that was put into place here, the Pope proclaimed that this relic, being enshrined here, symbolically meant that Louis IX, Saint Louis, was crowned with Christ's own crown. Of course, he had his royal crown, but being crowned with the crown of thorns, or possessing the crown of thorns, meant that he was crowned with a far more dignified crown than any other he could gain. Our friend John of Gendon, who did that description of Paris, talks about that most beautiful of chapels, the Chapel of the King. It has exquisite features, which he lists, and they bestow such a hyperbolic beauty on that house of prayer that in going into it, one believes oneself as if wrapped to heaven, entering one of the best chambers of paradise. And then he goes on to exclaim, "Oh, how salutary prayers to the all-powerful God pour out in these oratories, when the internal and spiritual purities of those praying correspond with the external and physical elegance of the oratory," the chapel. One of those other descriptions of the city of Paris also waxes eloquent about the Sainte-Chapelle and talks about the relics that are preserved there. The crown of thorns, a piece of the cross of Christ, many other relics, and a large foot of a griffin. What's that doing there? We saw last time that people often showed the same sense of wonder for purely secular stuff, but we know from another source that there was this thing dangling from the vaulting of the Sainte-Chapelle, which was identified as the foot of a griffin. What's it doing there? Yeah. Was that one of the sacred relics that Louis purchased from the Emperor of Constantinople? I doubt it, but there it was. There it was. That is the crown of thorns, and that is the shrine in which it was displayed. Okay. Other building of obvious significance, the cathedral, Notre Dame. Here again, we have a connection between early Christian antiquity and later Christian, Capetian Christianity. The early Christian cathedral of Saint-Étienne was a little bit to the west of where the later cathedral was. It was rebuilt in the Romanesque in the 12th century, and then in the late 12th and 13th century, the building that now stands was put up. It was completed in the reign of King Louis IX, Saint Louis. Let's again turn to our friend John of Gendon. That most glorious church of the most glorious Virgin Mary, Mother of God, shines out like the sun among stars. To be sure, there are those who, because they are able to see only a few things easily, say that some other church is more beautiful. But I believe that if they attend more diligently to the whole and to the parts, they will change their opinion. Where indeed would they find two towers of such magnificence and perfection? Where would they find this? Where would they find that? They look at the parts, they realize how magnificent they are, and they look at the whole. I believe, says he, that this church offers the carefully discerning such cause for admiration that its inspection can scarcely sate the soul. And I took this photo in 2018. I've been back since then. It doesn't look quite the same. One of the portals of Notre Dame in Paris, just about all the cathedrals are Notre Dame, so Notre Dame of Chartres, Notre Dame of here, Notre Dame of there, but Notre Dame of Paris has this portal showing King Louis, Saint Louis, and his queen. But it's been argued that the Louis, at this particular point in the final construction of the cathedral, wasn't all that devoted to the cathedral. He was more devoted to the Cistercians and the friars. But the canons of the cathedral wanted to draw his attention, so they were representing him as a major patron of the cathedral as a kind of inducement. That's probably the case. It is, however, the case that later on, he donated to the cathedral the south rose window, and his funeral was at Notre Dame Cathedral. It is also claimed by the canons of Notre Dame that, yes, to be sure, Saint Denis may have most of the body of Saint Denis, but they have the top part of his head because the executioner cut off, sliced off the top of his head, and they've got that at Notre Dame, so they claim. So, okay, in the case of Paris, we've got Saint Denis and Saint Geneviève and Saint Denis, the Basilica of Saint Denis and the necropolis and King Louis and Notre Dame. All of these things are woven together. There are very close connections, binding past and present, or distant past with more recent past. And the saints of antiquity are fervently devoted, so fervently venerated in later centuries. Not so much when we turn to London. London is a different story. Thinnest connection between pre-conquest and post-conquest London. First of all, there are major saints in England, but none of them venerated quite so much in London. Saint Edmund was a king of England who was martyred in the war with the Danes. He's off in Suffolk. Saint Alban, a martyr in Roman antiquity, back when the Roman Empire extended to England. Saint Alban's cathedral is in Hertfordshire. Saint Thomas Becket, his shrine is, of course, in Canterbury. The star there represents London, the red star represents London. So London is kind of left out. Doesn't have any of these major shrines. And look at the city of London in the late Middle Ages. We've got two chief centers. We've got Westminster, down to the lower left, which is well outside the city of London, and we've got the Cathedral of St. Paul. But London is neither the political capital. London proper, the city, is neither the political capital nor the ecclesiastical capital. The political capital, when it gets a capital of any sort, and for a long time, Winchester is kind of the capital, but when it settles in Westminster, it's well outside the city. And St. Paul's is not where Archbishop resides. There's a bishop, but the Archbishop is often Canterbury. So it's kind of side-lighted. Pivotal figure is St. Edward the Confessor. How did St. Edward the Confessor get to be canonized as a saint? You could say two reasons, basically. He was a really nice guy, and he and his wife didn't have sex. So if you want to become a saint, you really, no, you don't have to follow his example. That's maybe a bit of a parody, but basically he was venerated as a saint because he was said to be a mild-mannered person, never complained to anybody, and he and his wife had a celibate marriage. Technically, he was the second to last of the Anglo-Saxon monarchs. But he had very strong Norman sympathies because from age 10 to age 40, he was sent off for safekeeping to Normandy to reside. And he only came back to England to become King of England. And he always maintained close ties to Normandy. So after the Norman conquest, the Normans are happy to honor him because they see him, technically he's Anglo-Saxon, but they see him as kind of one of their own. He's also the first English king said to have had the royal touch, the ability to touch sick people and to cure them, especially to heal scrofula. This is a gift that French and English kings enjoyed from the Middle Ages well into the modern era. We are told when Edward the Confessor was in exile in Normandy, he took a vow that if things got settled back in England, he would go on pilgrimage to the tomb of St. Peter in Rome. That's familiar, isn't it? But then when he became king and things got more settled, he consulted with his advisors and they said, leave the Kingdom of England and we're going to have more trouble. We need you to stay here. So he said, okay, I made this vow. I ought to keep the vow. What am I going to do? So he referred the matter to the Pope, and the Pope said, fine, I will dispense you from your vow on the condition that you donate all the money you would have spent on the pilgrimage to Rome to the poor, and you either build or rebuild a monastery dedicated to St. Peter. And so he decides to rebuild the monastery of St. Peter at Westminster. And then just after he has done that, he dies, and we have him on the Bayeux tapestry here being carried to his burial at Westminster Abbey. Before terribly long, Westminster Cathedral, or excuse me, it was a cathedral briefly in the 16th century. And there's another place, the Roman Catholic Cathedral, but that's neither here nor there. Westminster Abbey, which originally he built. It became an important seat of government with Westminster Hall close by it, the House of Commons, or the precursor of the House of Commons, met in this complex. This really became the seat of English government, and Westminster Abbey became kind of one of the key chapels for the English government. It was rebuilt in something like the form that we see here, something like that form, in the 13th century, when King Henry III decided that he was going to build a new, grander, more glorious Westminster Abbey, honoring Edward the Confessor, but also competing with Saint-Chapelle in Paris. You may have, if you've been there, you've probably seen the Lady Chapel, which is where King Henry VII is buried. Originally, that was going to be the shrine for King Henry VI, who was a kind of very pious, many thought saintly king. So Henry VII writes off to Rome saying, I want my predecessor, Henry VI, to be canonized as a saint. And the Pope writes back and says, give me this humongous amount of money and I'll do the canonization for you. We've heard that story before. In any event, it ended up not being a shrine to Henry VI as saint. But Edward the Confessor was enshrined there. The shrine that was put in the 13th century looked something like this. People going on the shrine on pilgrimage would have been in these little niches praying to the saint for cures. What's there now is a pale reflection of what was there in the 13th century. What we do see now is something different. There have been 39 monarchs crowned at Westminster Abbey, burial site for 18 monarchs, at least 16 royal weddings. And on top of that, it's become a kind of national church or English Valhalla for burial of all sorts of people. Geoffrey Chaucer worked at Westminster Abbey, so it was natural that he would be buried there in what later became the Poets' Corner. But it was mainly in the 19th century that the Dean, Arthur Stanley, decided to make this into a national Valhalla with the burial of Charles Dickens and Livingston and Darwin and others. So that's a tradition that had been prepared for earlier, but really got underway in the 19th century. Meanwhile, back in the city of London, we've got the old Cathedral of St. Paul's. There's an engraving of it and then a digital reconstruction of it on the right. What's going on there? It's dedicated to St. Paul. Do they have the relics of St. Paul? Well, they certainly haven't got the skeleton of St. Paul. What do they have? The missionaries who established these places when they converted England to Christianity, basically the best they could do in most cases was to get secondary relics or contact relics, a piece of cloth that had been touched to the shrine or touched to the relics of St. Paul was brought here. And that's probably what they brought to Old St. Paul's in London. That's probably the best they had. Later on, however, the city of London got a hold of the relics, the whole bodily relics, the whole skeleton of a different saint who had been a local dignitary. He had been one of the bishops of London. And they said, great, we can do here in London what they did in Rome. We can do here in London some version of what they did in Paris with Saint Denis. We can establish a cult, veneration of the noble and saintly Bishop Erkenwald. Now here I will ask for a show of hands. How many of you personally know anybody named Erkenwald? I trust somebody got a count. They made a valiant effort to puff up the cult of St. Erkenwald. They built this magnificent shrine for him. They had a feast day. They claimed there were real miracles worked by St. Erkenwald. They established a guild dedicated to St. Erkenwald. They wrote a new Middle English life of St. Erkenwald, and it never really caught on. There were other saints from Anglo-Saxon antiquity whose cult was promoted. If we look at the churches of London in the 12th century, a quarter of them are dedicated to pre-conquest saints, but some of them get rededicated to other saints because there's not so much interest in people with funny names like Osseth or Erkenwald. In the late Middle Ages, the way you tell whether a saint is really popular is to look not at what the churches are dedicated to, because there aren't so many new parishes being established, but there are chapels and altars inside churches and guilds, fraternities. And look at those dedications. Lots of them to the Virgin Mary, lots of them to John the Baptist and Anne and Christopher and Catherine and George and the body of Christ and the name of Jesus and the Holy Trinity and Thomas Becket. But the old Anglo-Saxon saints, not so much. There's not so much interest in them. People are really interested in these other international saints. And the old Anglo-Saxon saints, yeah, of course, they're aware of St. Edward the Confessor, but he's down the river. Barbara Hannawald has a wonderful book on ceremony and civility in late medieval London, in which she talks about how there are all these people who are coming from the countryside. They vastly outnumber the people who have been born in London, and they gotta be educated. They've got to be taught their manners, got to be taught whom to recognize as the authorities, the mayor, the alderman. So there's a lot of pageantry, a lot of ritual. Just one example, a new mayor is being installed. The old mayor and the new mayor gather with the aldermen on horseback outside the guild hall. They go in formal procession with maces and swords and livery and music and all of that stuff. It is a great kind of ritual procession to the chamber of the exchequer where the new mayor takes his oath of office. Then they go to St. Paul Cathedral to say a prayer for a bishop who back in the 11th century twisted the arm of William the Conqueror and secured major liberties for the city of London, it is said. So he's the one they want to venerate. And then they go to the graveyard at St. Paul's and they pray at the tomb of Thomas Becket's parents who are there. And they do other things. They pray here, they march in procession there. And then after they've had dinner, everyone returned to his home. And the morning and the evening were one day, says our account. Ring any bells? The book of Genesis talks about creation. The first day, the second day, the third day, morning and evening were one day. The swearing in of a new mayor in the city of London is like the day of creation. This is civil religion writ large, but there's no bishop in sight. It's all secularized. It's all civil religion. And no hint of any recognition of those old Anglo-Saxon saints. Yeah, Barbara Hannawald goes on to say, same for the major feast days. They have all this pageantry, but it's not the same as at Venice. It's not the same as at Bruges. It's not the same as at Florence, where the church and the city are closely integrated, and where, in most cases, the past and the present are closely integrated. No, London is focused much more on the present and is much more secularized than any of these other cities. So this is the argument. This is the thesis. In Rome, a real, a strong, forceful connection between the two layers, but it's vexed, it's complicated. In France, in Paris, a very closely integrated connection. And in London, not a lot going on. Okay, I think we have time for questions.